I want to share with you in this first module some thoughts about how innovation happens in markets, in governments, in institutions. Because how do we keep up with the change in the world and the way that the climate is changing? And it's really only through our innovations in policy and the way governments act that we can confront, which is probably one of the biggest existential crises that we face together ever. Governments are here to serve us for the public good. And one of the biggest public goods is how markets function. That's a very basic concept, but we often hear free markets, the invisible hand. Free markets are very efficient. But what are free markets? Free markets are actually social constructions. These are things created by us. Think of a market where you go to buy your vegetables. There are certain norms. You wouldn't steal vegetables, that's not acceptable. And the same thing applies to bigger markets. Markets always have rules. They're never entirely free. They're social constructions. When markets don't function well, then you have unexpected outcomes. And maybe one of the biggest unexpected outcomes from the way markets function is climate instability. Climate instability is growing because our economies produce huge amounts of externalities. Externalities are things that we don't expect. They're surprises, like CO2 emissions. We never really thought about CO2 emissions. But when you breathe in, there haven't been as many parts per million of CO2 in our atmosphere for over 8 million years. We have radically changed the climate that's all around us in our markets, in our policies, in our institutions. How do we actually deal with the innovation that's needed? How do we create the innovation that's needed? There is a remarkable combination of leadership that's required at the government level, at the policy level, of learning and sharing. And I think some of the things that bring me the most hope is when I look across the globe today and I see tremendous leadership in shaping the markets, in creating the conditions for good outcomes. Think of, for example, the case of Germany, which decided several years ago to radically change the way they produce electricity. They're having an energy transition. It's not perfect, it's not without its flaws, but they're moving from nuclear and fossil fuel to renewable energy, clean, renewable energy. Think about China. China now is demonstrating huge leadership through what they call ecological civilization, the war on pollution. China is the biggest producer of solar PV now. They single-handedly brought the price of solar PV from 30 to 50 cents per kilowatt hour to around 5 cents per kilowatt hour. Solar energy, renewable energy, is now more attractive than fossil fuel energy, thanks to China in a large part. So these are just a few examples of leadership to face the challenge that's in front of us as countries, as individuals, and as a global community to deal with the climate challenge. The enabling conditions are fundamental because that's what governments do. They set the playing field for the economic agents to invest, to consume, to produce. They send the economic signals. They can be price signals, or they can be regulatory command and control approaches. For example, Kenya recently banned plastic bags. That's very straightforward. There's no price mechanism. They're just not allowed. And that's leadership. Pricing is also hugely important. And as an economist, I'm always amazed to see how low energy is priced versus its actual cost. We know the societal cost of CO2 is around $35 to $70 per metric ton, but most energy is priced around 0 to 5 in terms of its CO2 impact. The classic is air travel. It's exempt from any taxation, jet fuel, and we have more than 4 billion passengers every year flying around the world and paying very, very low prices and having a carbon footprint that's nowhere near the reality. And that's because the price of energy doesn't reflect its actual cost. So that's where a government will come in and they'll say, actually, this price doesn't reflect the true cost to society. We need to actually increase that price until the economic agents see, yeah, that's what the actual cost is. And then we adjust our behavior and we innovate. We innovate to find ways to do what we want to do without imposing the costs on the globe. Local governments are typically more active because they're closer to where the action happens, which is people's lives. So you see a lot more innovation at the local level of government, sometimes than at the federal level. And I find the interesting area of innovation in terms of local government is with health. Because as the environment degrades, the air becomes worse, the garbage isn't collected, the water isn't drinkable, local governments are compelled to act because it's a health issue. It's an environmental issue, but it's also a health issue. An interesting example is in Quito, Ecuador. Quito is at 2,800 meters above sea level. So when cars drive in Quito, fossil fuel internal combustion engine cars, it doesn't burn the fuel all the way because of the altitude. And because it doesn't burn all the way, it's emitting all these particulates and volatile elements. And because it's in a bowl, it just collects there in the bowl, and the air quality is awful. And the people of Quito said, this is killing us. And they actually forced their local government to create very strict standards around fuel emissions and car emissions from the vehicle fleet in Quito. So it's just an example of local governments being more responsive. And I think if you look around the world, if you see mayors, the mayor of New York, the mayor of New Orleans, the mayor of Tokyo, they're going to be much more responsive to the demands of their people and innovating more along the curve to face up to the climate crisis.